Hello and welcome to the 28th episode of my podcast, Historians in Conversation, which is hosted by the University of Lodz in Poland. My name is Michael Green, and today my guest is Professor Leona Toker. She is Professor Emerita at the English Department of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. She was born in Vilnius, Lithuania, and she authored quite a few books related to literary studies, but she is also interested in literary history, and this is why she is here with us today. The conversation today will be revolving around academic career, but also around immigration and how this academic career could be built in the conditions of immigration. Leona will be telling about her way to Israel from Soviet Lithuania, about her choices, and about the way that she established herself as a scholar. I welcome Leona to my podcast, and I hope that you enjoy our conversation. Hello, Leona. Welcome to my podcast. I'm very happy to meet you once again, this time online. And maybe for our listeners, I will just mention that Leona Toker was keynote at the Ego Documental Conference, the first one that was organized in Vilnius. And that's where I decided that Leona would be a very interesting person to talk to at this podcast. So welcome, Leona.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
I always ask my guests about their childhood and the early days of their lives, because sometimes it's the place where motivation to be engaged in history, and maybe that's the point also to mention that you are a literary scholar who is also engaged in literary history. And this is what is of interest here for us. So childhood makes often, but not always, the child. So I would like to ask you about yours.
I actually was born in Vilnius, which you didn't know when you invited me for a conference in Vilnius.
That's true.
Right. But since I wrote 2 books about narratives of survivors, I was very interested in the Ego Documents conference, and not just in revisiting my old haunts, which was also an attraction. So I was sent by my parents to a school which was not considered to be very good in those days, but now it's the best school in Vilnius, they tell me, in Vilnius. There was a very good teacher there, a very good primary school teacher, who told my parents to pay attention to my writing well. I mean writing, but not penmanship. For penmanship, I got 1 and 2, the lowest possible grades. But then at the age 12, I switched to a school where they had an enhanced teaching of English, like the Solomeus Neries. At the time, that was the best school in Vilnius. Right now, I think it's not the best. So there is an interesting switch. And we did have English lessons every day. So that was very good.
Did you like history back then? Very interested in anything that had to do with history, considering that Vilnius is such a beautiful and also very historical. It's an extremely historical town with medieval buildings, Baroque buildings.
I was unhappy with the way history was taught in Soviet schools. I simply did not believe things. There were so many omissions and so many changes. Late in life, I started thinking, why is it that I don't know much about medieval history, for instance? So I went back to the school books to see what I have forgotten. I did not forget anything. There was just nothing. And during the classes of history in a Soviet school, I switched off into my dreams. Instead, I read a lot of historical novels.
When you finished school, I mean, I know the Soviet system, so you would study 10 grades, I assume, back in the day? 12. Aha, so in Lithuania it was different than in Russia and Ukraine. So when you finished school, what were your options? What would you study?
Well, I had wanted to study physics or mathematics because that was the safest thing for Jewish children. You could get a job as a computer programmer somewhere and not be touched by politics and things like that. But this was the year 1968. I got the gold medal, and the rule was that those who get the gold medal can take only one exam. And if they get the highest grade, they're immediately enrolled. This was the Prague Spring, if you remember. So the future seemed attractive. The future seemed to be socialism with a human face, just like they wanted to do it in Czechoslovakia. And under the influence of that change, though I was blind, my young years were passed during the thaw period when in Soviet thick journals they published a lot of good stuff, a lot of interesting stuff, and in book publication too. Lots of names were returned, so to say. But by 68, the thaw had been already frozen. I just didn't want to believe it. So I went to the English exam at the university, got the highest grade, and immediately got enrolled to the English department. And then several days later, Soviet tanks, the Warsaw-packed tanks, rolled into Prague. And that was probably the formative event of my young life. My whole vision of the world changed.
You were enrolled for the English course, but I think that you mentioned one important thing that I would like to ask you to, because I think that our listeners might not be aware. You mentioned something that I'm quite aware of, and you mentioned that it was the safest choice for Jewish children to go to. Perhaps you could explain what you mean by that.
Okay. First of all, Jewish boys had to go to the army unless they were enrolled in the university. So children wanted to enroll to the university. Girls were not in danger. I know a few who did go to the army, boys. And then when they graduated, they could get quiet jobs where they could work in their fields, technical, mathematical, computer programming, engineering, the fields which, unlike the humanities, did not require constant confessions of communist faith. You can quietly do your own thing, and you work in order to live well, to meet with friends, to have a whole social and spiritual life aside from one's work. Whereas in the humanities, there was constant pressure to toe the line in different ways.
I know this also from, personal experience of my family, that Jews also had often troubles to get accepted to study in the universities. That was the case in Ukraine during the Soviet times. I think that in Russia it was a little bit less problematic. But in Lithuania, was it a problem?
I think it was better than in Russia. Because in Russia, sometimes when boys, very, very talented boys went to try to be accepted in MFTI and go in those big universities, they were often failed in Russian composition, for instance, exam, for missing a comma somewhere. Little things were used against them, and the acceptance rate was very, very small from Lithuania, whereas in Vilnius and in Kaunas, the enrollment was, I think, fair. As far as I remember, the enrollment was fair.
So you began studying English at the university, but maybe it's a moment to mention also that, in fact, Your parents were also university professors, and as far as I know, your father was a history professor. Was it not something that you considered, or it was something that you did not want at that point because of this ideological impact that it may have had on you?
Indeed, you've more or less answered it. But then an interesting thing happened. When we decided to go to Israel, we wanted to smuggle my father's second dissertation, doctoral dissertation, like Dr. Habil, out, because it was based on a great deal of archival research. His research was about the German politics in the Baltikum during the First World War, so-called Landoberost, and how it all changed. And a lot of documentary evidence which he collected in archives in very many places. It was forbidden to carry out anything that was not printed. So what I did, I retyped father's dissertation on cigarette paper, very thin, with footnotes on the same page. He had 3 volumes, and the footnotes were volume 3. I retyped it so that the footnotes were on the same page where they were footnotes and not endnotes. So later on, we smuggled it out with the help of the Dutch ambassador in Moscow. I still remember him with a great deal of gratitude. But while I was retyping it, I was struck by the kind of analysis that father employed in dealing with German politics. Later on, I understood that this was the influence maybe of his early years in the yeshiva. It was some kind of a Talmudic analysis. At the time, I did not understand that. He left the yeshiva at age 14, lost his faith, basically. That's what happened. But he kept his Hebrew, and in old Lithuania, he made a living while he was a student by giving Hebrew lessons. So that kind of analysis struck me, and it stayed with me. So when I started doing literary studies at the Hebrew University, I filled in a gap that I had. I first went into structuralism, into structuralist analysis. But it kind of reminded me of my father's analysis as well. And then little by little, I turned to the more historical approach to the matter.
I would like to ask you about, if I may, about the reasons. Why did you decide to go to Israel? Because it is something that is pretty obvious to former Soviet Jews, but I think that our listeners may not be aware of the reasons behind the decision to leave your motherland and go to the historical motherland, of which a lot of us knew very little, or even if we knew more, it was not something that was appealing initially.
Right, and the Soviet propaganda kept saying that wanting to go to Israel is nationalism, it's bourgeois nationalism, etc. And as I said, during the Thaw period, there was the belief in socialism with a human face. So, eruption of Prague Spring affected this very much, and we started looking for another narrative, another way of giving meaning to one's efforts, to one's life, and was reading Jewish history. Now, not written by Jews, that's interesting. I read an antiquarian book of Jewish history written by some Protestant pastor, and ended with the words, and now they live dispersed throughout the world, universally despised and persecuted. Persecuted was right, but when I read despised, I had such a surge of angry feeling that the idea was no, we ought to show something different. So that was another influence. And the third influence was, again, my father, how he tried to catch every glimpse of documentary footage from Israel. How on a trip to Romania, on the floor, on the ground, he found some piece of paper with Hebrew lettering, and he almost burst into tears. So I understood that there was something so there was a lot. And of course, also, there was official antisemitism at the time in the early 70s. Even in Lithuania, official antisemitism, I don't mean streets and things like that, which meant that it was extremely difficult to find a job. That was my husband's problem, and he finished the physics department. He was at the top of his class, and he did not get any of the 20 positions that were available in the university, in the academy, anywhere. He had to go to a factory, then he switched to teaching physics at school. When I was graduating from the university, I had no job prospects either.
It sounds very familiar because my mother, when she finished, she was actually offered to join the scientific department, and when she filled out the questionnaire about her ethnicity, she was told, well, you understand that we cannot take you. So it was later in the 80s, but it was still the same approach that hasn't changed.
Yes. It was still the so-called stagnation period, and there was tacit official antisemitism, more or less tacit. They very often found all kinds of explanations.
So you made a decision to go to Israel. What year was it, if I could ask?
We made that decision in 72, but then we postponed a bit for various reasons, and we eventually left in October 73. That was the second night of the October War when we landed in Israel.
So you ended amidst war, which was a very tough war for Israel, and didn't not scare you to be there at that time?
We understood nothing. We did not understand. We were well treated because at the time, the new immigrants, it looked like there were many of them, like about 200,000, but it's nothing in comparison with the 90s, okay? We were pretty well treated. We were taken to an absorption center in a southern town in Dimona, given an apartment there with everything that was necessary. Of course, the cheapest kind, but everything that was necessary. And I was really stunned that we have not done anything for that country, and look how they are treating us. So we spent a couple of months in Dimona studying Hebrew, and then both my husband and I got accepted for the doctoral studies in the Hebrew University. So we moved to Jerusalem.
Why Hebrew University? Why not Tel Aviv, for example, Haifa? Because all of them had English departments.
For us,
Beersheba, which was much closer.
The first priority was my husband's, but we made it to our old university. Beersheba, it was not called Ben Gurion then. Beersheba, Haifa, Tel Aviv, and Jerusalem was last. When we came to Jerusalem, we didn't want to leave. It was love at first sight. Also, we had a friend here who took my husband by the hand, and together they went to different laboratories in the physics department and talked to different people. And the same day, my husband was already enrolled. So then I went to the English department, and I also got enrolled 2 days later.
How different it was back then in comparison to nowadays, and how difficult it is to get accepted into a university for PhD position. But maybe we can fast forward to the study, the university, the doctoral study itself, and reach the end of it, and that's perhaps one of the more interesting questions about getting a job. Because getting a job is a question that a lot of us face when we finish PhD studies, and many people don't ever get an academic job, and a lot of them have to leave and go into some other branch of work, I don't know, business or similar things. Was it something that you already envisaged when you were a student, that you wanted to continue into the academia to become not only a lecturer but a researcher?
I did. At the time, one had to sort of not express this ambition too clearly. I also taught at school in Jerusalem for 4 years. And I must say that I did not like it because I had school practice in Vilnius. And it was so happy. I mean, the children were so good. And the lessons were so well. The children were interested and very disciplined, well behaved, and did all the homework. And in general, it was a very happy time, that school practice. So I expected much the same in Jerusalem, and the Israeli schools are nothing like that. That was a bit of a culture shock. Also, I was so new. I had bad Hebrew yet. At that time, I did not understand much about holidays and about how the children live with the idea of with the spirit of the holidays several days before that, and so on and so forth. It was very difficult, so I wanted to find something else. Then my children were born, and I understood that I have to quit school, and because I need my nerves for my children. And then I started looking for a job. It was very difficult because even at school, I was regarded as a kind of a freak. A teacher from Russia, they didn't distinguish between Russia and Lithuania. I had to keep reminding them. A teacher from Russia who teaches English, a strange animal. But then there was an opening in the English department to have to replace somebody. That turned up very soon after my twins were born. So I was offered to teach a course in the history of English literature. It was not a history, it was called Historical Approach to English Literature from the 18th to the 20th century. And when I saw the syllabus of that course, I saw how little I knew, but I did not admit that. So I spent the summer preparing that course. And since then, I taught that course for 40 years.
I guess now you know.
Well, yes. Now I can kind of know the material.
So, how did you get the job? What was the way that you managed to get this job, and actually also a permanent position eventually? That's this turn from PhD student, you were offered to teach a course, but it's still not enough. What did you have to do in order to actually get there?
You see, the situation then was not the same as now. First of all, I must say that the period after one finishes the PhD, I call it the heroic period in a young person's life, because even when one gets postdocs here, there, and anywhere, and it is as if one does not have to work for a living, one can do one's research, but the anxieties are killing you. So it's really, one has to show strength and stamina and a heroic period. But at the time it was different. At the time, in our department, after somebody completed the PhD, the department read parts of the PhD and the writing and decided whether it wanted this person to join the department. If they decided positively, then they would fight for a position with the dean, with the rector, with whoever it took. Eventually, this was called inbreeding, and this was totally discontinued. But in my time, it was still the case. So the department decided that it did want me, and they did fight with the dean for positions. Now, they were not permanent positions. They were for 2 years only. There was the position of somebody in the rank of a lecturer. And during those 2 years, and usually this came after a postdoc, because before a postdoc somewhere, one was hardly ever really fought for. So during those 2 years, one was expected also to publish and to have a good record in teaching. And I must say that my first book, which was not a dissertation, I wrote a book about Nabokov when I finished the doctorate. It was accepted for publication the last possible moment in the course of these 2 trial years. If the acceptance had come a little bit later, it would not have worked. So then there was a kind of a promotion, and then there were 5 more years of being a lecturer, after which there was the question already of a permanent situation. But the position was there. One had to just prove oneself. That is, the publish or perish system, and decent teaching. Also some service.
Well,
but now it's different. Now the department has absolutely nothing to say about for whom they are going to fight. The faculty publishes the number of departments for which there is a competition. And then people apply, and then the department has to decide which are its favorites among the applicants. And then in the faculty, a competition is staged between the favorites of different departments, so that they always publish more competitions than there are actual positions in the faculty. So the candidates not only fight with each other, they don't know that they fight, thank God. I mean, they compete with each other in the department, and then the favorites of each department are brought into a general competition in the faculty.
This is a very interesting system because maybe that's the case in Jerusalem. I know that in other universities often it's a completely fake competition because the person is already either working or has been decided in advance. And in fact, people are being called to be statists at competitions, which I find a very disturbing practice, unfortunately conducted in many universities worldwide, not specifically in Israel or elsewhere, but it's a very common thing. So what you tell me now, it's quite interesting because I, for example, was not aware of how it goes in Jerusalem.
Yes, what you are describing is the corruption of the system.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not sure how deep the corruption has penetrated which university. But when the system that I have described was established, it was kind of idealistic. It's kind of idealistic. All the corruption very often sets in. One tries to fight it.
But in this case, at least, people do stand some chance, at least, for their merit, and not only for their connections. If the people from different departments compete with each other, then, well, maybe the one with the best connections wins, but still maybe it's someone who has a little bit more merit than the other person. While if it's only done by connections, then in fact the nepotism wins.
That's very true. But there is also the additional problem of how people from different disciplines appreciate the merit of a candidate from a discipline in which they don't understand much.
This is
Does
true.
this candidate win by some kind of a cheap appeal or real merit? So, of course, that system has its flaws too. I must say, however, that in the final decision, the faculty also approaches external referees to evaluate the candidates. So there is every possibility for promoting academia and recruiting people on merit. How the corruption gets into that, to what extent, where, and how, I don't know.
I think that unfortunately the outcome of this corruption within the university system is the fact that a lot of people who are not really qualified enter the system, and they don't produce anything valuable to anyone. And I don't want to give specific examples, but I know certain departments where they had great people back in the day who got there actually because of merit, because they studied in great places or because they were supervised by great people, and then they became great, historians themselves. But the next generation, which was already not selected based on the same principle, were not great historians anymore, and you actually don't know anything about them. You don't see their names appearing anywhere. And I think it actually ruins our work as scholars, as researchers, because it doesn't promote us. And I don't know why those who are in charge of this don't see it.
Yeah. Now, this whole business about inbreeding, on the one hand, it's like a double-edged sword. On the one hand, great scholars are expected to bring up the science, the heirs, so to say, bring up good pupils, good students. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. One knows many good great scholars who did not
That's true.
raise scholars like themselves. Now, these like themselves, the institution may want them, or it may want, that is what is recommended now, one wants to get like fresh breezes from elsewhere, from different approaches, different specialities, etc., which is very important in one respect, but maybe damages the possibility of continuing a certain school of thought, on the other hand.
I think this is very sad, the place that academia is at this point, and to be honest, I don't see any change coming anytime soon. There's also fear of the other, because, well, we know that person has been working with us for 16 years, and we want that person to continue being our colleague, even if that person is maybe not as good as the person who's coming from elsewhere. But we are afraid to take challenges. Then we need to learn to deal with a new person. Personally, I find it sad, because I think that learning to know new people actually is a positive thing. It gives you a lot of food for thought and maybe stimulates your thinking in a different way so that you can become a better scholar. Once you're exposed to new sort of triggers, maybe new experiences, new thoughts. You mentioned that you were interested in history despite being actually a literary scholar. And perhaps you could tell a little bit about that. How do you connect between the two subjects in your research?
So 40 years of teaching what was called historical approach to English literature, which was not positivistic history that I read a lot of. I read the history of French literature, history of English literature, those positivistic narratives with chronology, with dates, with etc. We taught that course differently. We had a sequence of representative works, mainly poetry, and through the analysis of these works, we tried to point to literary trends, features of the style and of the thematic issues of each period. So it was like periodization, but coming from the text, in context, of course, of that was the teaching part, and that influenced also my research quite considerably. The need for context, historical context and literary historical context. But recently, there have arisen some very interesting other ways of dealing with literary history. The whole question of influence and tradition, theorizing influence, theorizing tradition, theorizing intertextuality, so to say. Gerald Prince's idea of the disnarrated. What is mentioned as a plot possibility in a work of art, but not developed. And then a student of mine wrote a dissertation showing that what is disnarrated in one work may be actually narrated in a different work. Now, I have moved recently to the so-called history of topoi, looking at literary history from the point of view of a specific topos. For example, a person sacrificing his life instead of a beloved person, or for the sake of a beloved other. That is a topos that is rooted in a real event during the French Revolution. And so many literary works have dealt with it in different ways. So looking how such a topos rose, how it waned, how it was replaced by others, is another approach to literary history. And I must also say that my studies of literary history were influenced by the German historian Jürgen Kocher and his reading of Mark Bloch, where he supplemented Mark Bloch's comparative approach. You study the phenomenon in another literature, in another history, in order to see what questions you forgot to ask in your initial field, what questions you dismissed, etc. Okay? What you would have never dealt with or asked had you not studied the material of another nation, so to say. He supplemented this by the idea of entanglement. Not influence, but entanglement. Different literary strands get intersected, entangled with each other, and affect each other not by way of, let us say, either apprenticeship or, on the contrary, rebellion, but in other ways. So I think that study of literary history can be influenced by the methodology of history studies on the one hand, but it can also come up with its own methods. For instance, the study of a particular topos across national borders, genre borders, across different periods, and asking how the development of that topos is influenced by the historical and cultural context on the one hand, and by the inner dynamics of literary imagination on the other hand, by the dynamics of looking for innovation.
I think that we had a very interesting conversation, and a conversation that was revolving not only around motivation to engage with history through difficult times and life of new immigrants everywhere, not only in Israel, is a very tough thing. So I think that the fact that you actually went to continue your studies and you became a doctor and then you became professor shows that you had a lot of determination and a lot of personal will and stamina to endure the difficulties and also to succeed. So I think you are an example in many ways of how people should not be given up on their dreams and to achieve them. So thank you, Leona, for this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.